Now we're going to talk about trips down to Florida, to Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel Island.
We first went down to, first Fort Myers Beach, because Howard Nichols had a dealership, a Chevrolet dealership in Homer, and annually, each winter, they would go down to Fort Myers. And it talked a great deal about it. So when we went the first time to Fort Myers, because of them, they took us and showed us around, and we kind of liked the area. So the following years, when we went to Florida, we always managed to go down to Fort Myers Beach because of Howard Nichols introduced, and who almost were natives of Fort Myers Beach because they were there every winter. And they had a car, and so every time we would visit Fort Myers Beach and found a place to stay, we would socialize with Howard and Clara Nichols. And they had their boat, and then of course they didn't have any children, they were fond of our children and would take us to different places on the island, down on Fort Myers. And after being introduced by them with the area, then we would rent a place someplace down around Fort Myers. And it would be the same place, but just in that area. Then it became very popular. And we found out going to Fort Myers, Sanibel Island, when we first were introduced to Sanibel Island, you had to take a ferry to get to Sanibel. And we just fell in love with Sanibel. And we could drive from the boat as it docked down to the far end of Captiva, which was really well developed, and you could get to Captiva by boat from the mainland. So after our first trip to Sanibel, which we had to go by boat to the island, and then eventually the island became so popular they built the causeway so you were connected to the island. So it made it very easy to go to Sanibel. And then Sanibel was very fertile with shells and so forth, because it wasn't so well traveled at that time, because Iraq, like I say, you had to take a ferry to get there. Then actually when they built the causeway, well then it just became very popular. It just killed all the shells, all the big shells were just found. Then it became, later on in the years, Florida passed a law you couldn't take any shell bigger than, I forget how big. But prior to that, you could take everything. We had boxes of shell on our early trips. So each year, after our first year, we just kept going back in different places, but in that area.
And you brought the family, the children, when they were very young.
Yeah, but when George was very, in fact, Tom was the youngest one, and then before Carol was born, and Howard Nichols, who was going down, who was on permanently during the winter, developed a liking to a little Tom, and so when they went shelling into the water, they just associated, and because they didn't have any children, he just left town. And that time, Tom was very fair-skinned, so he had to cover up with all kinds of stuff, otherwise he'd get burned. And then Clara Nichols would take Carol as a baby and kind of help Betty out so she could have a little free time. So they were very good, but they were there every winter. So going to visit them, and we got introduced and we found places, so we would go down and find a new place each year, or maybe the same place.
And when did you go down? And was it? You said it was Easter break usually.
Well, we first started going down around Easter, Easter break and so forth, with our kids. They were small, and they weren't all in school. I think maybe Georgie might have been the only one in school. And we would go almost, after that we would go annually practically for 1 or 2 weeks down to Fort Myers.
And you still did that even up until a couple years ago.
Right.
All right, let's move over to Charlie and Esther now. And you've already talked about how you brought him in as your R&D person at the foundry, and then you had a friendship. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, Charlie was a professor at Michigan State, and at these foundry conferences at Lansing, of course he was very active with Lansing being in his field. And I went up going to the meetings and the conferences. I made it a point to become very close to Charlie because he was a leader in the foundry industry. And as a result, I was gleaning all I could from him. And then I had him come down to the foundry at least once a month or so. And he was sort of like an R&D. He would just go through the foundry, kept observing what has to be done. So, and I was doing it without telling him what to do. I was just asking him to do what he would want to do. So it kept us as a small progressive foundry with our leadership with Charles. And a closeness, and I was always looking for freebies. Then when they had its foundry conferences in Europe, became a member, could go to Europe. And then I got Charlie. So I was involved with the foundry industries internationally, but I had an ulterior motive. I wanted to get the chips. So of course, we always, when the conferences came up each year, we got all kinds of letters to come down and participate, which we did. And then I got Charlie to participate, which he did. And being a professor at a foundry conference gave us a little an armor, because he'd be very close to the main speaker of the program.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, I had ulterior motives with everything I was doing. And as a result, we were very active in the International Foundry Group. And in fact, I think we're the only American foundry. They're one of the foundry leaders in the United States had come down, but they just weren't interested in. But I was interested for traveling. And so I went to all the conferences in Budapest and Bucharest and Romania and in Belgium, I forget now, towns, and in France. So each year I'd go to
Australia and New Zealand?
That's on the other side, so that's another story. Yeah. But so when I was in these conferences, it gave me a chance to go to these conferences on business. And Betty was a secretary, so she came along to take notes. So we were past any legitimacy of what we were doing. And then we got involved in New Zealand. That was another story. And the fellow from New Zealand was in Chicago to buy a Hunter molding machine at where they manufactured it. They were interested. And he was from New Zealand and Chicago, and of course he was just bewildered by the bigness of Chicago. And the salesperson at the molding machine salesperson, when this fellow was there to buy a machine, which he did buy one, and of course we had bought some, so we were really close with the manufacturer of these molding machines. And then the fellow from New Zealand just say to the bigness, and the guy said, hey, there's a small the foundry in Homer, small town. So the fellow just came up to get out of the big city, and he came and he visited our foundry and stayed at our foundry, and he got a room at Nelbit so he could be here for a week or a couple of weeks, so we got a relationship with him. So when he went back to New Zealand, where he kept our correspondence.
Do you remember his name? No?
He'll come.
Okay.
See, I'll never forget. And he was a character. And then when we visited them in New Zealand, we stayed with them, and our neighbors was the mayor of the town in New Zealand we stayed in, so we had traveled. So I met all this foundry people from New Zealand and Australia. The only American group they have was there. So I bet those people went to their conferences. And so I stayed my relationship with them after we developed it in Chicago. And I went to continue it with a relationship in New Zealand and visiting. So then we made excursions in New Zealand almost every other year. Then we'd go visit Australia in the foundry industries. So, like I say, my ulterior motive was to get all these freebie vacations and so forth. And at one time, we were gone for 3 months, visiting and having fun. And we went first class, never touched a suitcase after we got there. We went all these different places until we got back, and we got our suitcases when we got back to Detroit after 3 months of going all over. But you did think that which helped us in our foundry operation. At one time we were the most modern little foundry in the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's quite an accomplishment. Let's tie this in with, there was a conference once upon a time in Jacksonville, Florida, and the Segerfusses were there, and then you invited them to come down to...
Yeah, well, Segerfuss was at a conference. Well, they were staying in Jacksonville. He had a Esther, I went there, that's where they went for the winter. And then it just so happened there was a bunch of guys from professors from Michigan State were at Jacksonville, and they had a Valentine's Day, a dance, or not a dance, but a party and a meeting and so forth. So we stopped to see Charlie and Esther and attend that conference at Jacksonville. And got to meet them, and it was on the Valentine's Day, remember that? And we were on our way to Fort Myers at that time, but we stopped to spend and we talked to Charlie and Esther where we were going. So Charlie and Esther said we were going to be there, and Charlie and Esther, they flew down and to meet us, and then he fell in love with the place, so they made it a point to find a condo that they leased for the winter. And then we were at Sanibel, which was where the condo was. So we got to be together with them at that time. And then every time when we were in Florida, we always went to dinners with them, and Fort Myers Beach and at Sanibel, and so our relationship was wholesome in Florida. And then this year when I forget how many years later, Esther got sick, and Charlie had to leave, and Betty and I flew up to be with him, and she recovered, and so we came back to Sanibel. Then later on, Esther was failing, and she did die while she was in Florida, while she was, this was years later. And of course, they brought up to Lansing for the funeral. And Betty and I flew up for the funeral and went back because we had a 2-month stay at Sanibel. And Charlie was alone. And so he stayed pretty close. Well, Charlie's daughters lived around that area too, so I got to know them, and they were close to their dad. And then later on, many years after going to dinners with them, every time we were there, we managed to go to dinners with them. And then the last year, after Esther passed away, then they had a place in Florida that they were there for 3 months all the time, so we used to stop by and see them. And then when she died, and we flew up for the funeral, and of course that was the only time Charlie kind of wept, in the funeral. And then after that, Charlie would go down alone, and then near the end, when he was slipping, and her daughters, of course, they were, her daughter said, "You don't want to go and see him," because he was just vegetating in his wheelchair. So that was the last of Charlie. But we were there with him when his wife died, and then when he died, we came up for the funeral.
They were good friends, weren't they?
Pardon me?
They were real good friends of yours.
Oh, definitely. Well, like I say, when they did his founding conferences, I didn't know anything. But I always went up and sat next to him and wanted to glean all that I could from him, which I did. Then we developed a relationship, and I hired him to come down at least once a month and train some of our supervisors.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, George.